Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Laser i3 PLC Leaders webinar series. My name is Kyle Demars Johnson, and I am a program assistant with the Laser i3 project at the Smithsonian Science Education Center. I will be moderating tonight's webinar. Tonight's webinar is the third in our six-part series for Laser i3 PLC Leaders, and the subject is Know Thy Impact, Becoming an Increasingly Effective Collaborative Team. The SSEC and Laser i3 team would like to thank the U.S. Department of Education and our match funders for supporting the Laser i3 project and making this webinar possible. Neither the U.S. Department of Education nor any of our private sector funders are responsible for the content of this webinar. I'm going to start with quickly going over some housekeeping. All participants will remain muted throughout the webinar. The GoToWebinar software tracks your attendance and participation in the webinar. Please submit questions through the chat feature in the webinar software in the toolbar. Please select the Submit as a Question option when doing so. These questions can be technical if you're experiencing problems with the software, or content questions about what is being discussed. If you prefer, you may also email my coworker Dana Bulba, whose email address is displayed on the screen. We really would like a high level of participant involvement with this webinar, so please do ask questions as they come to you. We will also be conducting some brief polling throughout the webinar, so please do answer those questions as well. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's presenter, Robert Reetz. Rob leads professional learning for Mounds View Public Schools, a district of 10,000 students located 10 miles north of Minneapolis-St. Paul, Minnesota. He has coached collaborative teacher teams in Mounds View to implement a formative assessment process into their instruction, provide improved and timely feedback to students, establish equitable grading practices, and become much more culturally and linguistically responsive to students and families. Rob also helped launch, and now works to support, a STEM-focused urban teacher residency program in partnership with 6 private universities in Minneapolis and St. Paul. He is an adjunct professor at Hamline University and at the University of St. Catherine. So without further ado, Rob, please take it away.
Appreciate it, Kyle. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to make sure that I have control over the PowerPoint here. Kyle, it doesn't appear as though I'm able to advance the slide. I'm going to start today by going over our agenda, and I've broken the presentation up into 3 parts. The first being a discussion around the research to provide some context for why teacher collaboration has such a large impact on student achievement. Secondly, I'm going to work to distinguish the difference between being a group and being a team. And lastly, the main component of the presentation is going to be on these 6 core factors of highly effective collaborative teams. And those factors are teams that have a common challenge, that build relational trust, that have efficacy, and I'm defining efficacy as the team's belief in their ability to produce a desired result. We're also going to go over briefly some instructional protocols that yield high achievement, and discuss the importance of adult learning with an emphasis on embracing each other and utilizing the genius down the hall. Lastly, the presentation today will conclude with a brief overview of John Hattie's critical mind frames, which I believe are necessary for helping teams develop an important growth mindset. So I wanted to start with a bit of a background on John Hattie's research on visible learning, primarily because Hattie gives us a framework for understanding why teacher collaboration has such a significant impact on student achievement. So I want to talk briefly about what visible learning is and the research that John Hattie put in creating this framework that we're going to use today. So visible learning is really about teams of teachers knowing their impact, and about students being able to articulate what they're learning and how they're learning it. Hattie believes we ought to make learning visible. He believes that teachers and students should work together to determine whether and to what degree they met learning goals. So if this is Hattie's basic thesis, that learning should be visible for students and that teachers should work to make that learning visible, I want to talk about exactly what he did to conduct his research. Over a number of years, Hattie set out to determine what works best in education. He really thought to himself, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could take virtually everything that's ever been researched and determine three key things. What is it that schools and teachers do that enhances achievement? What is it that schools and teachers do that has some effect on achievement? And what is it that schools and teachers might do that has a negative effect on achievement? And so what Hattie did was develop a way of ranking various influences in different meta-analyses according to an effect size. In his groundbreaking study in 2009 titled Visible Learning, he studied over 800 meta-analyses, over 52,000 research studies involving over 250 million students, with the goal of determining a range of influences from very positive effects to very negative effects on student achievement. And so what you really see here is a continuum of Hattie's research in which a 0.4 effect size is really the average of what we do, knowing that it has some impact on student achievement, but then also realizing that anything that has a 0.7 effect size can be considered excellent, and anything that has a 1.0 effect size can be considered as producing major growth, what Hattie says up to 2 to 3 years of growth. This particular slide that you're looking at is showing the effect size of feedback, as well as the number of meta-analyses Hattie studied. For feedback, he studied 23, and the number of studies he reviewed specific to feedback, which is over 1,200. And he used all of that research to determine that feedback has a effect size of 0.75. He concluded that giving students actionable feedback is among the most influential things teachers can do to cause learning. So what I want to really focus on is what he actually realized has the greatest impact on learning. And that is collective teacher efficacy. And this really brings us to the point of why we're focusing so much on PLCs and the impact collaborative teams can have, those that are effective and those that are seeking to know their impact, what they can have on the achievement of students. Collective teacher efficacy, as I said a little bit earlier, is really the group's ability or belief in their ability to produce a desired result. Hattie says that has a 1.57 effect size. I believe there's a poll related to some of the effect sizes that do have the greatest impact, or some of the strategies and influences we might use in education that have the greatest impact. One of those strategies is self-reported grades, the idea that students, when they outperform how they expected to perform, their achievement increases significantly. Another really important component of our influences on student achievement is providing clarity for students, helping them understand what it is we intend for them to know, and ensuring that they have a strong understanding of what success would look like. We talked a little bit about feedback to students and its effect size, now at a 0.73 in Hattie's most recent updated research. And also the importance of teachers receiving feedback on their impact on students' learning. And we're going to talk a lot today about teams of teachers creating common assessments that they use not only to determine where students are at, but also as feedback on their impact, on their ability to cause students' learning. We're also going to talk about the importance of positive teacher-student relationships, as it has an effect size of 0.72. And lastly, we're going to talk a lot about teacher collaboration as being job-embedded professional development, and this notion that all of us have attended various conferences or even the professional development for all staff in our buildings, and we've gone back to our classrooms and found that that professional development hasn't really had a major impact on our teaching. But we know that the job-embedded professional development that occurs in PLCs does have the kind of impact that actually changes and improves instructional practices in teacher classrooms. So that's a little bit of the research, knowing very clearly and unequivocally that this high effect size for collective teacher efficacy is the reason why we're focusing on collaboration. I want to pause for a second and see if Kyle has any questions that you all may have posted that I might be able to answer prior to progressing toward the second component of today's presentation. Kyle?
And we don't right now. Thank you.
Okay, we'll continue to move forward here. The second component of the presentation is really focusing on the difference between a group and a team. And I think it's really important to understand how groups and teams function differently to get a sense for the extent to which the teams, the collaborative teams at your buildings are working interdependently. So I want to talk a little bit about this image here. This is my wife, pictured here in orange, running the Twin Cities Marathon. And you can see all of the runners behind her, and certainly the runners in front of her, they all have a common goal or a common challenge. They want to finish the race. And many of them are probably hoping to finish the race in a time that's better than any previous marathon they've run. They all want to have a personal best. But you would never describe the runners behind my wife, pictured here, or the runners in front of her, or even the spectators alongside her, as being a team. They're all really doing this individually. And the reason that is because they're not relying upon each other necessarily to finish the race. My wife's not relying on anyone else to meet her personal best. This means they're more of a group than they are a team, because for me, the best teams, the actual teams, work interdependently. They rely on each other to produce their desired result, and without each other, they wouldn't be as effective at producing that desired result. So we're going to talk today a lot about how we can foster interdependence and the importance of teams working interdependently. And so what I'd like for you to do is actually engage in an exercise right now. I'd like for you to grab a pencil and paper, something just quick that you can write on. It's not something that you'll save, but it might be something that you reference back to, because I believe that this activity that we're about to embark upon is something that you can use back with teams at your site. And it's specific to fostering interdependence, maybe of just one PLC that you're working with, or you might actually use this as something in which you might do when you're leading all staff professional development. So what I'm going to show you is a pyramid of 25 letters. And I'm going to give you 15 seconds to memorize the pyramid. In fact, when the pyramid is showing on your screens, I don't want you to do any writing at all. When the pyramid disappears, I want you to quickly jot down as many letters as you can in their correct order. So I'm going to give you a second now to just make sure you have that pencil and paper. All right, 15 seconds. I'm going to show you the pyramid. Don't write anything down. As soon as the pyramid vanishes from your screen, document as many of the letters as you can in their correct placement. Ready? Go. All right, quickly jot down your letter pyramid, and I believe there's going to be a poll asking you to just type in the number of letters you got correct. I'm going to show you the pyramid again in a second so that you can correct your work. But right now you should just be trying to write down as many of the letters in the correct place as possible. Let's in fact go back to the presentation and we'll show the pyramid, and then our participants can determine how many they answered correctly. So here's the actual pyramid that you just saw. And if you could determine, how did you do? Determine the number of letters you have in their correct place. So how did you do? Most teachers average between 6 to 9 letters correct when they do this independently. And if you were to do this with your staff, you do exactly as I've done here. Show the pyramid for 15 seconds, take it away and have folks document. And then what I typically did was have them average, if they were at a table with other teachers, the amount of letters they got correct. Or if I was with the small group, just go around the table and say how many letters they got correct. And again, it's usually between 6 and 9. But now I want you to think about doing this with teams of up to 4. Each team has 1 minute to strategize, and then you show a new pyramid for 15 seconds. And again, you don't allow any writing while the pyramid is showing. And what you're going to find is when teams do this and strategize together, they're usually going to get between 23 and 25 letters correct. And while that's a great outcome of the activity, it's really not the point. The point is to then have teams reflect on how they felt after they strategized together and did the pyramid together. And most frequently you'll find that teams said, individuals on these teams said, I really felt like people were relying on me, so I wanted to do a good job. I really felt like I could trust my other teammates to do their job so that we could get to all 25 letters. And ultimately, when they express these things, what they're really expressing is the need for interdependence, and for us then to say, this is what our collaboration should look like. We should feel like we're relying on each other to improve our practice. We should feel like we're relying on each other to know our impact and know whether what we did was effective or ineffective. So I could show you the next pyramid so that you had a sense for what the next pyramid would look like. This is the one that the teams would strategize around and then do together. But you don't necessarily need my pyramid of letters. You could do this on your own. Just create a simple pyramid with 1 letter in the first row, 3 letters in the second row, 5 letters in the third row, 7 letters in the fourth row, and 9 letters in the last row. And do that twice for 2 different pyramids and lead this exercise. I promise you it'll be very engaging. And even if you take pictures of teams as they're doing this, they're as engaged as you will ever see a PLC. And to have a reference point to always go back to when you're working with a PLC or working on a PLC to say, remember how engaged we were when we did this activity? This is how our meetings should feel. They should be positive. We should be feeling as though things are going really well. So I want to pause again real quick to check and see if there's any questions that may have been posted that you guys might have.
No questions right now.
All right, we'll continue on with the core of the presentation, talking about each of these 6 factors of high impact teams. The first is common challenge, the importance of teams to have some common challenge or common goal that they're all aligned and working toward meeting. The second is the importance of building relational trust, having strong relationships with each member on the team and working intentionally to build those strong relationships, but also using collaborative norms to ensure that the dialogue within our PLC or collaborative team meetings is such that we can operate in tension and get around any conflict that might surface as a result of discussing student data. Thirdly, we're going to talk a lot about efficacy and the efficacy of the team. And again, hoping to view efficacy as a team's belief in their ability to produce a desired result and to know their impact, and ultimately for teams to do that enough that they get on a winning streak, and that getting on a winning streak will really help teams build the belief in their ability to, again, produce a desired result. We're also going to talk about instructional protocols that lend themselves to high achievement, going back somewhat to some of the work that Hattie did, improving what works best in education. And then we're also going to focus briefly on adult learning. This idea that the culture of learning in schools is as much for teachers as it is for students, and to know that we as teachers need to embrace each other as learning resources. And we're going to talk about all of that by focusing on Hattie's critical mind frames, the mind frames teachers and teams have to be in order to produce and maximize their impact. So the first thing I want to refer to when we talk about common challenge is this notion of being aligned. I've worked with a lot of groups that have really done great things and worked really hard, but really engaged in random acts of collaboration because they weren't really aligned toward one common challenge. So working randomly is denoted in the arrow on the left, whereas being aligned is the arrow on the right, where everyone's working toward that same common challenge. And your common challenge should specifically be related to student learning experiences, whether it's specific student learning or the experiences that student has, maybe related to student connectivity. I say that because I think it's really important that PLCs not just focus on what teachers do, but that they instead focus on student learning. Now here's the real core of common challenge. Being able to answer these 4 questions, and they come from Richard DeFore in a book called Learning by Doing, actually written by Richard and Rebecca DeFore, as well as Robert Eaker and Thomas Meny. And the first question really effective PLCs are able to answer is, what do we want all students to know or be able to do? And what this is really determining are the common outcomes as well as the progressions for learning that teams must agree to as they collaborate and as they plan their instruction, so that when they go back to their classrooms, they all have a sense for not only what students are learning, but the progression for how they must best go to achieve that learning. Secondly, the question, how do we know when students are learning? If teams of teachers are able to answer this question, it's likely because they've developed or are developing common assessments or common measures for those outcomes that they've designed. And whenever a team develops common assessments, it's really important that they develop proficiency scales. That is, the extent to which students will show understanding of their common outcomes. And when teachers do this together in teams, they not only develop common assessments that are a much better measure of student performance, but also they develop common measures that are more aligned to what proficiency would be of a particular standard. So if a team has common outcomes and a common assessment in place, it's really then important to answer the question, how will we respond to student performance? First, how will we respond when students don't learn? And by that I mean, can the team put together common relearning plans aligned to their success criteria that really helps students who didn't meet our learning outcomes to eventually meet those learning outcomes? And what I really want to emphasize here, and the problem I see with a lot of teams that I've worked with, is they want to move on very quickly to new outcomes, even though they haven't gotten many of their students to meet their learning. I think it's really important to prioritize what we want for students to learn and be okay not moving on, or be okay with figuring out how we can continue to embed this learning when we do move on to new concepts. Because oftentimes what PLCs should study is learning that we know will endure. That is, learning we know that will be spiraled back to either in this course or in future courses. And to know if it's that important that the learning take place, we ought to make sure that 100% of students meet our basic level of proficiency that we set at the onset of our planning. The last question PLCs really need to be able to answer is, how will we respond when students already know or can do it? It's really important that teams collaborate around the notion of digging deeper. A lot of times students are going to meet our learning goals really early on. And if we've discussed as a team creative ways in which to take those students deeper, their learning and ultimately their achievement is going to be much higher in the end. I think it's the hardest thing to do for a teacher in isolation is determine how to go deeper for students. It's not easier necessarily in a team, but the solutions at digging deeper and going deeper for learning for kids is much more effective when it's done in collaboration and through dialogue with other teachers who are teaching the same content. Another really important component of highly effective collaborative teams is building relational trust. And by this I mean working intentionally to establish strong relationships with each person on your team. I really want to emphasize that every person on any PLC has something about them that is likable. And we've had to work really hard with our PLC leaders to find the likability factor in each person they're working with. But I promise you it's there. And one key goal for PLC leaders, or really for any member of a PLC, is to set a goal to find something specific about each person that you like, and more importantly, to know 3 things about each teacher not related to education. I want to pause here to include a poll question that Kyle's going to put up related to relational trust for teachers. So 67% of us have established group norms in our PLC. And the reason I wanted to determine that right away is because part of the way in which we're going to talk about building relational trust, in addition to knowing things about the people we're working with, is through collaborative norms. And I'm actually going to spend a little bit of time talking about the most effective collaborative norms and how best they might be used in a PLC. First, the most highly effective teams set norms that allow for each other to speak candidly, to speak their truth. They also have norms specific to listening intently and to making commitments to each other and having a willingness to acknowledge when someone breaks a commitment so that they can bring it up in a way that doesn't put people on their heels in a meeting. Other really important things that highly effective teams do is they cheer for and celebrate each other's successes. And most importantly, they openly share struggles and weaknesses. In essence, they're willing to be vulnerable with each other. And so while I see that some of you have set collaborative norms, 33% of us haven't. And what I want to do is focus specifically on some really important value statements or collaborative norms that I think will help teams the most. Eventually, I'm going to end the discussion on collaborative norms by giving you a really good process for ensuring everybody has a chance to contribute to the establishing of collaborative norms. First, I really want to emphasize the importance of probing for specificity, for having a norm that says we value probing for specificity. When I work with teams, I often find that I don't see a lot of participants asking each other questions within a meeting. I think it's really important that teams ask each other questions because it's getting at improving the communication of the team and the specificity that's needed for teachers to really understand what's being shared. I also really like it when teams have value statements related to paying attention to self and others. And the reason this is important is because if you look around the room in a PLC meeting, you'll oftentimes find people are pushing their chairs away from the table or looking down or distracted by a device. It's really important that when you pay attention to others, you start to see what is being communicated by their body language, and also what are you communicating to others by your body language. Lastly, I think it's really important to have some of these agreements to courageous conversations, like staying engaged and experiencing discomfort, because if we are not ever operating in tension in our PLC meetings, it likely means real change is not happening for teachers. We need to expect and accept that tension is going to happen, and also that some of our meetings are going to end without getting closure, and that's okay at times to end a meeting by expecting and accepting non-closure. So let me do this. I'm going to give you quick another protocol that might help for establishing norms back at your building. And again, this comes from DeFore's book, Learning by Doing. And it's specific to giving each participant on a PLC an index card and the same writing utensil, and having them write down 5 value statements that they really think are important for the productivity of the team. Then what you do is, after everyone has their 5 learning value statements, shuffle them all up, put them all together, and hand them back out, 5 cards to each teacher, so that it's likely they don't have all of their norms. They might have a few of the norms that they wrote. But then you have each member read them round robin style and categorize them. They put them into piles. The largest piles become clear norms that many of the people on the team value. And then you have some standalone piles, maybe 1 or 2 cards, that the team really discusses and determines, is this an important norm for us? And I would say, prior to finalizing your list of norms, really make sure they're written in present tense and that they're written as value statements. And make sure you don't have more than 5 to 7 norms, because the goal should be for teams to be able to articulate their norms from memory. And what I find is teams go through this process of establishing collaborative norms, and then they never really use them to address tension that might be in the room or conflict that might be rising as a result of some of the discussion that's taken place, or maybe some of the data that's been presented at the meeting. All right, so we've talked a little bit about common challenge and the importance of building relational trust. And now I want to get into efficacy. And I want to talk specifically about getting on a winning streak. Again, if efficacy is the team's belief in their ability to produce a desired result, it's really important that we are able to do this consistently. What DeFore says is we should never go more than 20 days without studying our collective effect on student learning. And so one of the things I think teams really need to do is narrow and prioritize a focus for learning. And by that I mean they should take a standard and prioritize it in such a way that they're able to unpack it into chunks of manageable teaching that can take place over perhaps 20 days of instruction. I also think it's really important that teams set a SMART goal, that they sit down and determine, for this one specific skill or concept, we're going to get 100% of our students to meet this level of proficiency, and then to develop that common measure that we talked about earlier. The goal for the team then should be to return to their classroom and know exactly what they did to produce the result, so that when they come back together as a team, they can share that result with their other teachers. And I promise you, when teachers start to see that they're making an impact on students' learning, they're going to feel like they're on a winning streak. And when teachers are on winning streaks, so too are students on winning streaks. Now I want to quickly talk about the high-yield instructional strategies that are really important that teachers develop. And here's the real key. As Hattie says, it's really important to develop kid-friendly learning targets and success criteria. Criteria that will help students understand what proficiency looks like prior to engaging in any one lesson for a specific day of teaching. And then also to really be able to share with your colleagues what teachers did to produce the learning that they produced in a given day. I really like the idea of stand-up meetings, that after each day, teachers just come together for 10 quick minutes, they stand up and they talk about what they did today to produce learning and whether it worked, whether it clicked or whether it clunked. And it's really important to share those instructional clunks, because it's through our failures that we learn a lot more about what we can do differently to improve student learning. And I'll tell you, mistakes in teaching don't become failure until we refuse to go back and fix what we did wrong. The other thing I want to emphasize with instructional strategies is the importance of maintaining autonomy. That we don't want to produce teachers that are robots. We don't want to develop a one-solution syndrome. What we really want is for teachers to plan their instruction together around common outcomes aligned to a common assessment, but then to go back to their classrooms and engage in experimentation, but to really know what they did to produce their desired result, and to come together collaboratively to create solutions to non-routine learning problems as they occur. Because even the most effective teachers don't get 100% of their students to learn what they intended for them to learn in the first go-around. That's not how learning works. Students process information at different times. Students have different things that are on their minds away from school that might impact their learning. And so what we really want is for teams to have each member leave a planning meeting and engage in experimentation, but then to come back and know their impact. All right, lastly, I said we were going to talk a little bit about the importance of job-embedded professional learning and the notion that when teachers are effectively working in professional learning communities, they're really working to establish a culture whereby learning is as much for adults as it is for kids. I love this quote by Stanfield that says, if 8 teachers are conversing around a table, the truth lies not with any one of them, but in the center of the table among all perspectives. And the reason I like that is because I want to emphasize the importance of getting contributions from every teacher in your meeting. Lastly, I really believe that when we get contributions from every teacher, it's likely that they're going to share their best ideas. And Fullen and Hargraves, in a book called Professional Capital, they talk about the importance of sharing your best ideas, because what often happens is teachers return to their classrooms and generate new ideas. And that continuous practice of starting and sharing new ideas is really what gets at increasing student achievement across the board or across the grade level. So we've talked about a lot of our core practices of highly effective teams: developing a common challenge, building relational trust, building efficacy, engaging in the instructional protocols that we know work best, and also embracing each other as learning resources. Now what I want to focus on is establishing a strong growth mindset for this work. The difference between a growth and fixed mindset is pretty simple and pretty obvious. If you have a growth mindset, you oftentimes believe that intelligence and skill is developed over time. If you have a fixed mindset, you believe that intelligence and skill is static. And the reason I think it's important that teachers have a growth mindset is because they need to believe not only in their ability to produce a desired result, but in the ability of all teachers that they might be working with to produce a desired result as well. They need to believe that teaching, the skill of teaching, can be developed over time, and that it's really the work of the PLC to help each other develop that skill. Hattie says it's important for teachers to know that how they think is as important, if not more important, than what they do. If they think all students can learn, and if they think that they can cause that learning to happen, it's much more likely that the achievement of their students is going to be much higher than if they don't think all students can achieve. So the way in which we develop a growth mindset is by looking at and adopting Hattie's 8 mind frames, which I believe are key to developing a growth mindset. So the first mind frame is that PLCs believe their fundamental task is to evaluate the effect of their teaching on students' learning and achievement. And by that I mean assessments are not just to determine where students are at. They really should be looked at as an opportunity for teachers to evaluate how effective they were in causing learning to happen. And if we approach it with this mindset, we always view teaching and learning as on us. And it really brings us to Hattie's second mind frame, that what we do or what we don't do is how learning happens or doesn't happen. And what I really want to emphasize with this second critical mind frame is that teachers can be change agents. That just because a student didn't learn the first time we attempted to teach them something doesn't mean that we can't change that outcome for kids. Just because students have struggled with learning prior to taking our class or the courses that we teach as a PLC doesn't mean that we can't be change agents in their lives. We have to view our role as causing learning to happen and as being change agents for kids. And when we do, we significantly impact learning in a positive way. The third of Hattie's 8 mind frames is specific to, as a PLC, talking more about learning than we do about teaching. And I have to tell you, when I work with PLCs, what I often find is they're solely focused on talking about teaching. And I think the teams that are most effective, what they do is they focus more on student work and on student learning. And they look at student work to try to analyze what specifically students did that they might use to be able to share with other students that weren't proficient on the assessment to help them see learning through the eyes of other students. It's really important to focus on the learning, the process students went through to achieve your learning outcomes, so that you have a sense for what you might help non-proficient students with when you go back to reteach. The fourth of Hattie's 8 mind frames is specific to viewing assessment, again, as feedback about your impact on learning and achievement. It's when we view feedback from assessments as being about our impact that we don't blame students when the learning doesn't take place. Because really blaming students doesn't do a whole lot for anybody. It in fact only gets in the way of us attempting to produce the result that we wished to produce at the onset of our planning. Hattie's 5th mind frame is specific to engaging in dialogue and not monologue. And I think this is really important because most frequently when I work with PLCs, what I realize is that there's usually one or maybe two people that are the primary contributors in the PLC. It's really important that we seek to get contributions from all members of the team because all members of a PLC have something important to contribute. I promise when we've sought to get ideas from teachers that haven't contributed anything, the team has oftentimes been blown away by what they might contribute, including first-year teachers, because of the fresh perspective that they might bring to a concept or skill or to a PLC in general. I think engaging in dialogue, not monologue, is an important rule not just for PLCs, but really for our teaching as well, to ensure that we are asking students to help us understand their learning experiences so that we can learn through them, see learning through their eyes to determine if what we're doing is having the kind of impact that we wish for it to have. The 6th of Hattie's 8 mind frames is that PLCs enjoy the challenge and they never retreat to doing their best. I don't ever work with teachers that I don't think are working hard. I think teachers work extremely hard. I think effective teachers work extremely hard. I think ineffective teachers work extremely hard. The problem is when we have teachers say, I'm doing my best, but they're not willing to do things differently because they think their best is all that they can do. The challenge of teaching is inherent. Learning is hard. Causing learning to happen is hard. So it can't just be about doing our best. It's really got to be about doing things differently and utilizing each other and tapping into each other's genius to really cause learning to happen to the extent that we know it can through the collaboration of our team. The 7th of Hattie's 8 mind frames is just this notion of a PLC believing it's their role to establish positive relationships in the classroom as well as the staff room. And if you remember, I'll bring you back to Hattie's effect sizes. He talked about the importance of teacher-student relationships as having a really high effect size. And I'll tell you, he calls it teacher-student relationships purposely. And by that I mean it's the teacher's responsibility to establish the relationship, to do things in their classroom that allows them to not only get to know their students, but embed things about their students' lived experiences into how and what they're teaching on a daily basis. But another really important aspect of this is establishing positive relationships with each other. It goes back to this idea of building relational trust. And again, I want to emphasize the importance of getting to know each member of your team, getting to know their lived experiences so that you can have a better sense and appreciation for why the teachers on your team respond to situations the way that they respond, or why members of your team do the things that they do. Because we have to realize we are all a product of our lived experiences. The experiences we've had, both as educators and in our lives prior to becoming educators, really informs who we are as people. And the way in which we get at the likability factor of everybody on our team is knowing unequivocally what the lived experiences are of the people on that team. So I really encourage you to be an investigator of who you're working with, to know them and know them well. And again, to set a goal for yourself to know at least 3 non-work related things about each staff member you're working with. Lastly, the 8th mind frame for Hattie is that PLCs inform everyone about the language of learning for their particular course or for their particular common challenge. And by everyone, I mean both students and parents, as well as other teachers, about what it means to learn in your classrooms. And that might be sharing the learning related to understanding learning targets, success criteria, learning specific to the development of a range of different strategies you are using to actually share with students, I'm using this strategy because I think it's proven to help other learners understand this content. Helping students know whether or not they're progressing toward your learning target, sharing with them, this is what success looks like, this is where you're currently at, and having them identify the correlation between where they're at and what they need to learn or where they need to get. And then lastly, getting students to think about visibly teaching themselves, helping students understand the importance of becoming a self-directed learner. I believe we have a poll question again related to these 8 mind frames. I'm going to have Kyle cue that poll question up here. Do you think people in your PLC already have or could have these mind frames, these 8 mind frames? Yes, no, or maybe with a lot of work. So it looks like some of these mind frames are pretty common to the teams that you're currently working with, which is great. If teams are viewing their primary role as determining the impact they're having on students' learning, I think we're at a point where they can be honest and open about the data that they're producing and maybe even embrace the vulnerability of not having done something well so that we can get back to our classrooms and utilize each other's genius and each other's ideas to improve our practice and ultimately the learning of students in our classrooms. That's the heart of my presentation today. What I want to do is open this up to some Q&A questions that you might have from anything that was covered in the presentation or anything that still might be circling in your mind related to PLCs and the practice of effective high-impact teams.
Hi everyone, this is Kyle again. Rob, thank you. That was an excellent presentation. As you said, we have a few minutes for questions and answers. So participants, please submit questions to the chat box in the toolbar and we'll respond to them as time will allow. I'll give you a few more seconds to enter some questions here. And again, these will be submitted only to our staff and will be answered anonymously. Rob, we have one question. How do we get schools to focus on science during PLCs? This person says that they typically focus on the tested subjects of reading and math. And there is really no county or school emphasis on science.
I think the best way to do it is to make sure that the team has a strong understanding of what it is that they're going to study, to get the team to focus on their collaboration as though they're engaging in collective action research. So to use a science standard and say we're going to study the extent to which we are effective as a team at teaching this standard, and then to break that standard down into smaller, more manageable chunks that you can study over time, say one specific skill or concept every couple of weeks, or maybe even after a month of instruction.
Okay. We have another excellent question here. This person asks, the people in my PLC joined because they have these mind frames. How can we carry these over to the other teams?
I think we have to first use these mind frames as specific talking points very consistently. Whenever we talk about why we're collaborating, we talk about it within the context of knowing our impact, determining whether what we're doing is having an effect or causing learning in the way that we wish for it to do. And the more often teachers hear that the reason we're collaborating, the reason we're doing this work is to know our impact, the more likely they are to adopt these mind frames. It will take time, but I think it's one of those, the more they hear it, the more likely they are to adhere to it, and to be very direct with teams when you sense that they're not prescribing to one of these mind frames, that in fact they're working in ways that would be the antithesis to one of these mind frames, and to just sort of take a step back and say, we've got to change our mindset for us to be as high impacted team as we all wish for us to be.
Thank you. Another question came in. Many of my PLC members are from different grade levels and different geographical areas. So how do we get everyone to focus on one goal?
Well, it's really the first step is determining what your common challenge is. And if they are in different grade levels and they are obviously across different sites, it's been our experience that we try to study the impact of connecting with students. So how do you measure student connectedness? How do we all put together a plan to determine the extent to which students are connecting to our classrooms, to our teaching, to each other, to us as teachers, to come up with a common measure for determining student connectedness? We also have had teams that don't have a Java-like person that they're collaborating with try to develop a specific language for learning, and by this I mean they try to develop a list of what effective learners do, a list that might be like perseverance. Effective learners persist. Effective learners reflect. Effective learners ask questions. And then ultimately what they do is they try to get students to articulate what effective learners do. And if, let's say, you get 80% of your students to articulate back to you what effective learners do, they then try to correlate that to the percentage of students that met many of their learning outcomes for the year. So basically what I mean by that is they say we're going to get students to meet our learning outcomes by studying how effectively we can get them to understand what the most effective learners do. So again, it's really that idea of coming up with a common challenge and viewing your role of a PLC as collaborative action research. We're going to see if we can get our students to do this and see whether or not it correlates well to actually increasing student achievement.
I think this is a related question. Somebody has asked, my PLC doesn't focus directly on classroom teaching. Should the primary outcome or goal still be student achievement?
Well, I'd be interested in hearing what the ultimate focus is. I think, to Hattie's point, teacher collaboration is most effective because it's proven to increase student achievement. And if that's really what we're intending to do as educators, is to increase the achievement of all students, including students that are traditionally underserved, we ought to, as collaborative teams, really focus on improving our impact on causing that learning to happen. And oftentimes it's when teachers focus on something other than student achievement that they ultimately begin to view the time spent on teacher collaboration as not really having the importance or the impact that it really could have. And so they start to sort of push away from their team because they don't view it as a valuable use of their time.
We had one person ask for a little more clarification on the section on self-reported grades and that impact on I'm sorry, I need to go back.
On learning, yeah.
Yeah, could you rephrase that maybe?
Yes, so I love this idea of self-reported grades. So this is really what Hattie says. You give students an opportunity to submit how they think they're going to do on an assessment before they take the assessment. And what often happens is students underestimate how much they know or how well they'll do. And whenever they outperform how they think they were going to do, their efficacy increases. Their belief in their ability to learn increases, especially when teachers show this is how you thought you do, this is how you actually performed, and they have a conversation with those students about their mindset going in and about what they did to produce the learning that took place. This is a really important component of my coaching for PLCs. So if there's anybody that would like to just view some self-assessment rubrics that I've helped teams create, I'd be more than willing to share them with you. They're really highly responsive rubrics to students' interests. For example, for younger kids, I have a Toy Story rubric that's a self-assessment rubric with the highest level of learning being To Infinity and Beyond and a picture of Buzz Lightyear. And I have some for older students too, but the point is that we're constantly getting students to reflect on how they're doing and where their learning is at to help build their efficacy and help get them to see that they are making some progress, because we know, as one of my slides indicated, when students get stuck or feel stuck, it has 3 times the negative effect on their motivation. And so the goal of student self-assessment is really to get them to see that they're making progress toward your end goal for learning. So please email me any requests for that. I'd love to share that stuff.
Great. And we have time for probably just a final question. One person has asked, how do we begin to focus on collaboration within the team versus looking at new ways to do science? And I think that means how to try to get the team to collaborate instead of just talking about science.
Well, I think, again, it comes down to your common challenge. I mean, if you wanted to speak somewhat broadly, the common challenge for your team is to think about teaching science in a more effective way and to really begin to narrow and prioritize the focus of what you wish to study. To say to teams, let's just study this one small aspect of learning science, or learning this specific standard in science, or this specific benchmark in science, because I think it's going to have a real impact on building that winning streak. When teams see, if we just narrow and prioritize our focus, we're much more likely to determine and be able to produce our desired result, and that's going to go really far toward increasing their efficacy for collaboration as something teachers do, to the point where I think it will help teachers begin to feel like they are a PLC as opposed to just doing PLC work.
Thank you, Rob. And unfortunately, we're out of time for this webinar, so we'll need to wrap things up. Thank you, everyone, for attending and participating. I also want to give a big thanks to Rob for such an excellent presentation and sharing his passion and expertise with us. Rob, thank you very much.
Oh, I really enjoyed it. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And again, this webinar has been recorded and will be made available on our website. Our next webinar will be on garnering administrative support for PLCs and will take place on Thursday evening, January 15th. Please look out for our monthly update email to PLC leaders, as well as further information on the PLC Leaders website. We also encourage you to continue the discussion on our recently launched Google Communities page for Laser i3 PLCs. Finally, when you exit this webinar, you will be directed to a very short survey. We greatly appreciate your feedback and your taking a small amount of time to respond to those couple of questions. Thank you again for attending. Have a great evening and holiday season. Good night.